Welcome, gentle listeners, to another journey into the shadowed corners of the past with medieval nocturnes. Tonight, we're peeling back the veneer of Victorian propriety to explore one of its most treacherous and overlooked frontiers, the snack. We're about to uncover a world of street food so hazardous it makes modern health code violations look like minor suggestions. We're talking about sweets colored with poison milk, thickened with chalk, and pies whose ingredients were a closely guarded and deeply unsettling secret. So, before we descend into this culinary underworld, if you enjoy our deep dives into the darker, more peculiar side of history, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep the forge lit for more tales like this one. Now find a comfortable position, let the world outside fade away, and prepare yourself for a time when a simple meal was a gamble and every bite was an act of faith. Let's begin. Imagine for a moment you've just woken up, not in your comfortable bed, but on a straw pallet in the year 1855. A thick yellow-gray smog presses against the window pane, and the air carries the scent of coal smoke, damp wool, and the distant, ever-present smell of the River Thames. Your stomach is a hollow, aching void. You have a single worn penny in your pocket, and the daunting task of finding breakfast in the deadliest culinary landscape in history, the streets of London. You step outside onto the slick, grimy cobblestones. The city is a chaotic symphony of noise. The rattle of iron-rimmed carriage wheels, the distant clang of factory bells, and the shouts of 100 different vendors. Each one is hawking their wares from a rickety cart or a simple basket, their voices cutting through the morning mist with promises of hot eels, fresh buns, and pies that could either save your life or end it. This isn't a farmer's market. It's a survival course. The sun is a pale, indifferent disk behind the smog. You're already late for your 12-hour shift at the factory, and the gnawing hunger is making your head spin. Your boots are damp, your coat is thin, and the city feels like a predator. But there on the corner, nestled between a pile of refuse and a horse that seems to be contemplating its own mortality, is your salvation. The Victorian street vendor. There are dozens of them, a frantic ecosystem of commerce and desperation. A woman with a face etched by hardship sells muffins from a basket, their tops suspiciously uniform. A man with a formidable mustache offers sizzling strips of bacon, though they seem to be composed more of fat and hope than actual meat. The competition is relentless, but so are the risks. Every vendor's smile is both an invitation and a warning. You scan the offerings, trying to make a calculated decision. A cart overflows with jellied eels, their slick bodies suspended in a cloudy, wobbling mass. Another vendor shouts about new-laid eggs, though the chickens that laid them are nowhere in sight and likely living in a different county. You spot a pyramid of apples, their waxy sheen glowing unnaturally in the gloom. A closer look reveals half are bruised, as if they've lost a fight with the pavement, while the other half are so perfectly round and hard they might be made of wood. The Victorian street vendor is a master of illusion, that plume of steam rising from the pie warmer. It's less a sign of freshness and more a clever smokescreen to hide the smell of yesterday's meat. Every purchase is a transaction built on a fragile foundation of trust and a profound lack of alternatives as you clutch your single penny. The most important question isn't what should I eat, but rather what is least likely to kill me before lunchtime. You've made your choice, the meat pie. It's a staple, a classic, and perhaps your final meal. You approach the vendor, a man whose gapped-toothed smile does little to inspire confidence. With your penny exchanged for a warm, dense pastry, you step away from the cart, clutching your prize. The crust is surprisingly firm, almost architectural, and it radiates a heat that feels like a small miracle on this chilly morning. With every hesitant bite, you try to silence the whispers of rumor you've heard in every pub and alleyway. Tales of pies filled not with beef or mutton, but with sawdust, spoiled meat, and the unfortunate cats that lingered too long near the butcher's back door. You find a relatively clean spot on a stone step and break through the crust. A puff of steam escapes, carrying an aroma that can only be described as meat-adjacent. It's a savory, peppery smell, but underneath it lies a deeper, more complex note that you can't quite identify. The filling is a uniform brownish gray, a mysterious slurry of minced something held together by a thick, gelatinous gravy. You can see chunks of what might be root vegetables, though they've been boiled into submission, their original form a distant memory. Victorian pies were a triumph of economic necessity over culinary integrity. Meat was a luxury few could afford, so vendors became masters of improvisation. The filling was a carefully guarded secret, a proprietary blend of a little actual meat, a lot of offal, and a generous helping of fillers to add bulk. Breadcrumbs were common, but so was sawdust, which provided a surprisingly convincing texture when soaked in gravy. The taste is, to put it mildly, complex. If you concentrate, you might detect a faint hint of beef, but it's quickly overpowered by the aggressive seasoning and the lingering taste of whatever else was on the chopping block that day. You take another bite, this time encountering something with a disconcerting chewiness. It's a piece of gristle, you hope. The rumors, however, paint a more sinister picture. In a city teeming with stray animals, anything with 4 legs was considered a potential ingredient. The old joke was that you never saw a cat near a pie shop, and while it was meant in jest, it held a kernel of truth that made every bite a small act of bravery. It wasn't uncommon to find a bone fragment, a bit of fur, or even a button, a tiny memento from a previous owner. Now, let's consider the kitchen. If you're picturing a clean, well-lit space, you are sorely mistaken. Most pie makers operated out of cramped, unventilated cellars or back rooms. There was no refrigeration, no running water, and the only cleaning tool was a damp, greasy rag. Meat scraps were left out for hours, sometimes days, collecting the ambient flavors of the city and attracting the local wildlife. Any bacteria that managed to survive the baking process were simply considered part of the seasoning, a little extra protein for your penny. But presentation was everything. Vendors knew their customers were wary, so they put on a good show. The top of the pie was often brushed with an egg wash or whatever brownish liquid was available to give it an inviting, glossy sheen. Some added a decorative pastry leaf on top, a small, artistic flourish to distract you from the culinary horror that lay beneath. And pepper, lots and lots of pepper. It was the great equalizer, a spice so powerful it could mask the taste of almost anything, from slightly off meat to outright despair. Despite it, all these pies were a lifeline for the working poor. They were hot, cheap, and filling, 3 qualities that were hard to come by. A meat pie provided the calories needed to endure another grueling shift in the factory or the docks. It was a small, savory rebellion against the hunger that was a constant companion. You didn't have the luxury of an ingredient list. You had hope that this pie was one of the good ones. You finish the last bite, wiping the grease from your chin with the back of your hand. You're full, and for now you're alive. As you toss the empty pie tin into the gutter, you can't help but wonder if you just ate beef, or if you consumed one of history's greatest culinary mysteries. You'll likely never know, but you're fueled for the long day ahead. And so you stand ready for whatever the city throws at you, a survivor of another round of Victorian lunch roulette. Your stomach, having miraculously settled the pie situation, is now sending out new signals. It's mid-afternoon, that weary hour when the body craves a jolt of sugar to carry it through the rest of the day. Your eyes are drawn to a nearby stall, a dazzling oasis of color in the monotonous gray of the London street. A confectioner's cart is piled high with jars of sparkling jewel-toned sweets in a world defined by shades of brown and soot. This display is nothing short of magical. You approach, hypnotized by the sheer vibrancy. There are lemon drops that glow with an almost supernatural yellow raspberry, lozenges of the deepest crimson, and pear drops of a brilliant, shocking emerald green. They look like treasures, tiny edible gems, promising a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. But this is Victorian England, where every silver lining has a cloud of industrial pollution. And the secret to these brilliant colors is a matter of chemistry, not magic. The dazzling emerald of those pear drops that comes from a pigment known as Scheele's green, a compound made with copper arsenite, yes, arsenic. The brilliant yellow of the lemon bonbons is often achieved with lead chromate, and the vibrant reds with lead oxide. Victorian confectioners, swept up in the era's scientific fervor, embraced these new chemical pigments with reckless abandon. They were cheap, they were vibrant, and they made the sweets fly off the shelves. Safety was an afterthought, a minor detail in the glorious pursuit of a candy bright enough to be seen from across the street. You spend your last halfpenny on a small paper cone of the irresistible green pear drops. The first one you pop in your mouth is a delight. It's sharp, sweet, and intensely fruity. But as you suck on the second one, you notice a strange tingling sensation on your tongue, followed by a faint but persistent metallic aftertaste. You dismiss it as part of the unique flavor. In reality, it's the first subtle sign that your body is having a polite disagreement with heavy metal poisoning. Parents lacking the modern-day arsenal of medical knowledge saw no harm in these colorful treats. After all, the sign above the shop door read, "Finest quality sweets." And who would dare to lie about something as innocent as candy? Children would spend their pocket money on handfuls of acid drops or fruit lozenges, blissfully unaware that each sweet was a tiny fruit-flavored dose of poison. If a child suddenly fell ill with stomach cramps, it was dismissed as gastric distress or a weak constitution, never the handful of arsenic-laced treats they'd just consumed. Beyond the toxic colorings, the candy's very substance was a deception. Sugar was an expensive commodity, so confectioners learned to stretch their supply. Many sweets were padded out with fillers, like chalk dust, plaster of Paris, or even powdered clay to give them weight and substance. That satisfying crunch you experience might not be crystallized sugar, but a less than wholesome mineral deposit that was never intended for human consumption. Yet the children adored them. They would line up coins clutched in their grimy hands, eagerly awaiting their turn. They'd compare their purchases, trading a leggiello drop for an arsenic green one, and proudly display their stained tongues to their friends. A tongue dyed an unnatural shade of emerald was a badge of honor, a sign that you had partaken in the most exciting, most colorful treat the city had to offer. You finish your last pear, drop your mouth still tingling with that strange, metallic buzz. The sugar rush is undeniable, but it's accompanied by a vague sense of unease. You survived the encounter, but you can't shake the feeling that you just played a game of chance with your own well-being. But that was the thrill of Victorians snacking: a little bit of pleasure, a little bit of poison, and a whole lot of luck. After the sharp chemical thrill of the candy, you find yourself craving something simple, something wholesome, something safe. Surely you think a basic loaf of bread couldn't possibly pose a threat. Bread is the staff of life, the cornerstone of every meal. With this comforting thought, you wander towards a baker's stall drawn in by what you hope is the honest, yeasty aroma of fresh baking. Piles of loaves are stacked high, their crusts a tempting golden brown. The baker, a man with flour dust in his eyebrows, hoists a loaf for your inspection. It's heavy, dense, and reassuringly large for the price. In Victorian society, the whiteness of your bread was a status symbol. A bright, pure white loaf suggested expensive, finely milled flour, a sign of prosperity. The common folk, eager to emulate the upper classes, demanded the whitest bread they could afford, and the bakers were all too happy to oblige, using a variety of clever and deeply unsettling tricks. The secret to that coveted snowy white crumb was rarely high-quality flour. More often it was a chemical whitener called alum. Alum not only bleached the dough, but also allowed it to absorb more water, producing a heavier, more profitable loaf from less flour. But bakers didn't stop there. To further whiten the bread and add cheap bulk, they mixed in chalk dust, plaster of Paris, and even finely ground bones collected from the city's less reputable sources. That loaf in your hands isn't just bread, it's a piece of construction material. You pay your penny and take the loaf, which feels more like a small paving stone than a food item. Tucking it under your arm, you find a quiet place to sit and try to break off a piece. It requires significant effort, the crust resisting with the tenacity of aged wood. When you finally manage to tear a piece free, you bring it to your mouth. The texture is dense, crumbly, and gritty. The flavor is overwhelmingly bland, with a chalky aftertaste that coats your tongue like dust. You chew slowly, your jaw working hard. You soon realize the crunching sound isn't the crust, it's the additives. Each bite is a lottery of non-food items. Was that a speck of plaster, a bit of ground-up bone? You try not to think about it. Eating this bread wasn't just a test of your palate, but a direct assault on your digestive system. The constant ingestion of alum and chalk led to chronic stomach ailments, constipation, and a host of other unpleasant issues collectively known as bread belly. Victorians, ever resourceful, developed ways to cope. The most common method was to dunk the unyielding bread into a cup of weak, lukewarm tea. The liquid would soften the crust just enough to make it chewable, though it did little to improve the flavor. Another trick was to spread a thin layer of lard, or dripping over it, the grease masking the chalky taste and adding some much-needed calories. If all else failed, the bread made an excellent doorstop, or, in a pinch, a projectile. Despite the widespread knowledge of adulteration, the practice continued. Newspapers would occasionally run sensational on the great bread swindle, but with little to no regulation, bakers continued to improve their loaves. For the hungry masses, chalk-filled bread was still better than no bread at all. It filled the stomach, even if it offered little in the way of actual nutrition. You swallow the last dry, gritty mouthful, washing it down with a sip of water you hope is clean. You feel full, but not nourished. The simple, safe loaf of bread has turned out to be just as much of a gamble as the pie and the candy in this city. It seems there is no escape from the culinary confidence game. Every meal is a reminder that survival depends on a strong stomach and a willingness to ignore what you're actually eating. Your morning tea is incomplete without a splash of milk, and your porridge is a sad, watery gruel without it. You listen for the familiar clatter of glass, bottles, and the cheerful whistle of the milkman on his morning rounds. He arrives like clockwork, a welcome sight, leaving a pint bottle on your doorstep. It looks innocent enough, a cool, opaque white promising nourishment, and a civilized start to the day. But in an age before pasteurization and refrigeration, that bottle of milk is less of a health food and more of a ticking clock. The fundamental problem was time fresh from the cow milk had a very short lifespan, especially in the sweltering, unhygienic conditions of a London summer. By the time it was transported from a rural dairy into the city and delivered to your door, it was already on the verge of turning sour. The race against spoilage was a constant battle, one that the Victorian milkman fought with a breathtaking degree of creativity and a complete disregard for public health. To make their supply go further, and to disguise milk that was beginning to turn, vendors perfected the art of adulteration. The most common trick was simple: add water, a splash from the local pump, or, if the milkman was feeling particularly unscrupulous, a bucketful from the Thames could easily double his stock. Of course, this watered-down product looked thin and bluish, a dead giveaway. To counteract this, he would add whiteners and thickeners like chalk dust, flour, or even a paste made from mashed sheep's brains to restore a creamy consistency. But the real danger came from the preservatives. To keep the milk from souring for an extra day or two, some vendors added chemicals like borax, or most alarmingly, formaldehyde. This was the same chemical used for embalming, and while a small dash could indeed halt bacterial growth, it had a similarly arresting effect on the human digestive system. You might take a sip of your morning milk and notice a peculiar chemical temps, or even a slight fizzing sensation, a sure sign that your breakfast was conducting an unauthorized science experiment. The consequences of this dairy deception were devastating, particularly for the most vulnerable. Infant mortality rates in Victorian cities were staggeringly high, and contaminated milk was a primary culprit. The collection of childhood illnesses, known vaguely as summer complaint, was often just a euphemism for the severe gastrointestinal infections caused by drinking this toxic bacteria-laden liquid. For adults, the effects might be less deadly, but were still deeply unpleasant, leading to chronic stomach pain and a general distrust of anything white and liquid. Other dairy products were no safer. Butter, often left unrefrigerated for days, could become rancid, developing a pungent aroma and a strange blue-green hue that was more alarming than appetizing. It was often bulked up with cheaper fats or colored with dyes to give it a healthy yellow glow. Cheese, meanwhile, was a living entity, aged in damp cellars. It often developed its own ecosystem of molds, mites, and sometimes even maggots. The pragmatic Victorian would simply carve around the most obviously inhabited sections and carry on eating. You pour a measure of milk into your teacup, watching it swirl into the dark liquid. You eye it with suspicion, giving it a tentative sniff. It smells fine, probably. You take a sip. It has a slightly chalky texture on the tongue, but it hasn't curdled, and nothing is actively fizzing. You count this as a victory. In the world of Victorian food, the absence of an immediate disaster was the very definition of a successful meal. You drink your tea, fortified for the day, your gut once again proving its remarkable resilience. It's now lunchtime, and the city's markets are a roaring tide of humanity. Having navigated the treacherous worlds of pastry, sugar, and dairy, you decide to try your luck with something from the river. A cart rolls by, piled high with seafood, its aroma a complex blend of salt, vinegar, and a faint underlying hint of peril. The vendor, a man with a voice like gravel, shouts his offerings: hot eel pies, pickled whelks, oysters fresh from the river. That last part should be a warning, not a selling point. You approach the stall, a tableau of maritime mystery jars, of pickled whelks, small pale sea snails, float in a cloudy brine that looks like a science experiment. Trays of jellied eels wobble precariously, their chopped sections suspended in a translucent, shimmering jelly, and of course, there are the oysters piled in wicker baskets, their shells still slick with the dark, murky water of the Thames in Victorian London. The river was both a lifeline and an open sewer, and any food pulled from its depths came with an unwritten disclaimer. You decide on an eel pie, a true working-class delicacy. Eels were plentiful, cheap, and famously resilient. They could survive in the polluted waters that would kill most other fish, making them the perfect, sustainable food source for an industrial metropolis. The vendor hands you a small, hot pastry. The crust is dark and glossy, and a thick, savory smell rises from the steam vent cut into the top. You take a bite and are met with a dense, chewy filling. The eel meat is soft, almost gelatinous, swimming in a thick, peppery gravy that has congealed in a way that defies culinary science. The flavor is intense, powerfully fishy, salty, and strangely earthy. It's the taste of the river itself, with all its secrets and sorrows. As you chew, you try not to think about what else the eel might have ingested during its time in the Thames. Freshness was always a relative term. Fresh from the river this morning could mean anything from caught at dawn to found floating near the docks. A slightly off taste was often masked with a generous dousing of vinegar or a heroic amount of black pepper. Then there are the oysters, once the food of the poor. They were sold by the dozen for pennies. A chucker could open one in a flash, serving it on the half shell with a splash of vinegar. You'd tip your head back and swallow it whole, a slippery, briny mouthful of the sea. The risk, of course, was colossal. Oysters are filter feeders, meaning they absorbed every contaminant the Thames had to offer, including the bacteria responsible for cholera and typhoid. Every raw oyster was a spin of the biological roulette wheel. The hygiene at these stalls was to be charitable, non-existent, the vendors' hands slick with fish. Juice would go from handling money to shucking an oyster, to wiping his nose on his sleeve in a single fluid motion. The knives were rinsed, if at all, in a bucket of the same river water. His wares came from cross-contamination, wasn't a concept. It was a business model. There's a reason why a sudden, violent stomach illness was a common feature of Victorian life. Yet London's appetite for this risky seafood was insatiable. It was a cheap, readily available source of protein in a city where hunger was a constant threat. For many, the taste of a salty oyster or a savory eel pie was a small, affordable luxury, a moment of pleasure in a life of hard labor. The danger was simply part of the bargain, a calculated risk taken in the name of a full stomach. You finish your pie, the robust, fishy taste lingering on your palate. You feel satisfied, but also acutely aware of the gamble you've just taken. Will you walk away unscathed, or will you spend the rest of the afternoon regretting your lunch? In Victorian London, the answer was never certain. You could only eat hope and develop a profound respect for a strong constitution. Let's step out of the grimy street and into the slightly more respectable, yet infinitely more treacherous world of the Victorian sweet shop. Through the smudged glass of the shop window, you see a wonderland of sugary creations. Jars are filled to the brim with striped humbugs, shimmering lozenges, and twisted ribbons of candy. But your eyes, like those of every child in the neighborhood, are drawn to the centerpiece. A grand pyramid of apple drops glowing a vivid, almost radioactive green. They are beautiful, perfectly formed, and gleaming under the gaslight. This splash of brilliant color is an irresistible promise of joy and escape. Victorian society was utterly captivated by color. The brighter the food, the more desirable it was perceived to be. Dull, natural-looking sweets simply didn't sell confectioners. Therefore were not just cooks. They were chemists armed with a new arsenal of industrial pigments to dazzle their customers. The secret to that mesmerizing green was a pigment called Paris green, a potent compound of copper and arsenic, originally used as a rodenticide and insecticide. It was also found to be a remarkably stable and vibrant coloring agent. With a casual disregard for toxicology, confectioners began adding it liberally to their boiled sugar mixtures. The result was a treat that was as deadly as it was beautiful. No one asked questions. The more unnatural the color, the more children would beg for a penny to buy a taste. The effects of eating these sweets were as immediate as they were insidious. The first bite was a burst of tart, apple-like flavor. But after 2 or 3, a strange numbness would begin to creep across the tongue, accompanied by a sharp, cramping sensation in the stomach. Parents, largely ignorant of the dangers, would dismiss these symptoms as the result of a sensitive disposition or too much excitement. Even doctors, who might be called in after a particularly bad case, would often misdiagnose the issue, blaming the city's bad air rather than the family's shared love of heavy metals. Occasionally, a major scandal would erupt. Newspapers would report on dozens of children from a single school falling violently ill after sharing a bag of green sweets at a party. For a week or two, public outrage would simmer. There would be calls for regulation and stern editorials about the moral failings of the candy trade. But without any real laws to enforce, the furor would die down, and the gleaming green apple drops would soon reappear in the shop window, as tempting as ever. For the children of the era, eating these sweets was a rite of passage. It was an act of daring a game to see who could eat the most without feeling ill. They would proudly compare their tongues, stained a shocking shade of neon green. Seeing it not as a sign of poison, but as a badge of honor, the risk was an unspoken part of the thrill. In a life filled with hardship and monotony, a little danger was a small price to pay for a moment of intense, sugary delight. You hand over your penny, and the shopkeeper twists a few of the glowing green drops into a paper cone. You pop one into your mouth. The flavor is sharp, sour, and undeniably exciting. You feel that familiar tingle on your tongue, a sensation you now know is not a feature of the flavor, but a warning from your own nervous system. Yet you eat another in Victorian England. You learned to live with risk, to find joy in the face of danger, and to hope that this time luck was on your side. Tired of the endless gamble of street vendors and their mystery pies, you decide to take control of your own culinary destiny. Surely you reason, if you bake your own bread, it will be safer, it will be wholesome. You imagine a warm, fragrant loaf, made with your own hands, free from the city's grime and deception, full of optimism. You take your hard-earned shillings to the local grocer to purchase a sack of the finest flour he has to offer. The grocer, a man who could sell sand in a desert, hefts a sack onto the counter. You open it and peer inside the flour. Is a vision of purity, soft, powdery, and a brilliant, snowy white. It looks perfect, exactly what you'd need for a light, fluffy loaf. You feel a sense of reassurance. This, you think, is the honest start to an honest meal. You couldn't be more wrong. In an era obsessed with appearances, that pristine whiteness is the first and most convincing lie. You get the flour home and begin the time-honored ritual of baking. You mix the flour with water, yeast, and a little salt. But as you knead the dough, something feels off. It's heavier than it should be, less elastic, and there's a faint, gritty texture under your palms. You dismiss it as inexperience, but the truth is that your flour has been improved long before it ever reached your kitchen. Millers and grocers routinely padded their flour with cheaper substances to increase their profits. That brilliant white color often came from alum or chalk, the extra weight that could be plaster of Paris, or more commonly, finely pulverized bone dust sourced from the local knacker's yard. For a truly budget-friendly filler, some even used brick dust swept from demolition sites, which added a certain heft and a unique earthy flavor you definitely didn't ask for. The sack of pure flour you bought is in reality a carefully crafted cocktail of grain, minerals, and industrial waste. You shaped the loaf and set it near the hearth to rise, but the yeast seems to be fighting a losing battle against the inert additives. The dough barely swells. Still, you press on, sliding the dense loaf into your small oven, hoping for the best. The kitchen soon fills with the scent of baking. But it's not the rich, warm aroma you dreamed of. It's a flatter, duller smell, with an underlying hint of something vaguely like damp stone or wet plaster. When you finally pull the bread from the oven, your heart sinks. The crust is as hard as iron, and when you tap it, it makes a dull, solid thud. It looks less like a loaf of bread, and more like a geological specimen. You let it cool, then take a knife to it, which requires a surprising amount of force. The inside is not the light, airy crumb you hoped for, but a dense, grayish mass that crumbles into a chalky dust. You take a tentative bite. The taste is exactly as you feared. Bland, gritty, and with a distinct mineral aftertaste. It's like chewing on a piece of wall. The profound disappointment is matched only by a sense of weary resignation. You went to all this trouble to escape the dangers of the marketplace, only to discover that the poison was already in your pantry. You wrap the rest of the failed loaf in a cloth, knowing you'll still have to eat it. Wasting food is not an option. Your attempt at culinary independence has only served to prove a grim Victorian truth. There was no safe harbor from the street corner to your own kitchen. The entire food system was a game of chance, and the odds were never, ever in your favor. Imagine a rare occurrence in Victorian London. A hot summer's day, the sun having fought its way through the smog, beats down on the crowded streets, making the air thick and stifling. On a day like this, the sound of the ice cream vendor's bell is the sound of salvation. You see him in the park, his cart surrounded by a swarm of hopeful children and weary adults, all seeking a moment of cold. Sweet relief, he offers penny ices, a small scoop of pastel-colored bliss for a single precious penny. The display is a tempting sight. Mounds of ice cream in shades of strawberry pink, lemon yellow, and pistachio green are nestled in metal containers. They glisten with condensation, promising an escape from the oppressive heat. You hand over your coin and receive a scoop in a small, thick glass cup known as a penny lick. It looks delightful, a perfect summer treat. But the beauty, as always, is a carefully constructed lie, masking a host of unpleasant truths. First, let's talk about the cream. Real cream was a costly luxury that spoiled almost instantly in the summer heat. Most street vendors couldn't afford it, nor could they risk it. The base of a typical penny ice was usually just watered down milk, often milk that was already beginning to sour. To give this sad, thin mixture some body and a deceptively creamy texture, vendors would add thickeners like corn flour, or, once again, our old friend, chalk dust. And those lovely pastel colors. They were courtesy of the very same chemical dyes that made the penny sweets so hazardous, the cheerful pink of your strawberry. Ice could come from a lead-based dye, while the refreshing green of a pistachio. Scoop was likely achieved with a touch of arsenic. Victorians were enchanted by these artificial hues, believing they signified quality and flavor, when in reality they were just a colorful disguise for cheap and often toxic ingredients. Perhaps the greatest danger, however, was in the serving method itself. That small glass penny lick you're holding was communal. After you finish your ice, the vendor would take the glass, give it a cursory wipe with a dirty rag or a quick dip in a bucket of murky water, and then refill it for the next customer. These unhygienic glasses became a notorious vector for the spread of diseases like tuberculosis and diphtheria. The simple act of enjoying a cold treat was in effect sharing saliva with a dozen strangers. You take your first lick. The immediate sensation is one of glorious, shocking cold. It's intensely sweet, the sugar masking the other, less pleasant flavors. But as it melts in your mouth, you notice the texture is slightly gritty, and there's a sharp, tangy aftertaste from the souring milk. You might also detect a faint crunch, which could be an ice crystal, a bit of chalk, or a stray piece of grit from the ice blocks that were used to freeze the mixture. Ice often harvested in winter from the city's polluted canals and stored for months in dirty cellars. Despite the litany of hazards, the penny ice was adored. It was a rare and magical treat, an affordable luxury that made a sweltering day bearable. Children would save their farthings for a chance to taste one, and adults would indulge with a sense of reckless abandon. The occasional bout of summer fever or a mysterious stomach ailment was simply the price you paid for a moment of cold, sweet happiness. You finish your ice and hand the glass back to the vendor, trying not to watch as he gives it a quick, unconvincing wipe before serving the next eager customer. You walk away, the coolness in your belly warring with a newfound sense of unease. You've had your treat, a fleeting moment of joy in the oppressive heat. Now you just have to wait and see if it was worth the risk. As the afternoon wears on and a damp chill begins to settle over the city, your craving for something cold is replaced by a yearning for something warm and substantial. Your eyes are drawn to a cloud of steam billowing from a street corner, and you follow it to its source. The pudding vendor, he stands over a large, bubbling pot, lifting the dented lid to reveal a collection of mysterious, cloth-wrapped bundles and battered tins. Hot puddin', a penny a slice, best in London, he cries, his voice a comforting beacon in the gathering gloom. This is the home of the penny dreadful pudding, the budget dessert of the masses. It's not a delicate, refined dish. It's a dense, steaming slab of carbohydrates, designed to fill an empty stomach and warm a chilled body for the lowest possible price. You hand over your coin, and the vendor expertly fishes a small, dark pudding from the pot, unwraps it, and cuts a thick, weighty slice that lands in your hand with a satisfying thud. It's warm, sticky, and smells intensely of treacle and spice. The recipe for a true penny pudding was less about culinary artistry and more about resourceful recycling. The base was almost always stale bread, the leftovers from the week soaked in water or questionable milk until it formed a thick, lumpy paste. To this, the vendor would add a generous glug of cheap, black treacle or molasses for sweetness and color, along with a handful of the lowest grade dried currants or sultanas. He could find fruits that were often shriveled, gritty, and had seen better decades. As you take your first bite, you're met with a unique texture. It's somewhere between a soggy sponge and wet sand, with dense, chewy pockets and the occasional welcome burst of a sweet currant. And then, of course, there's the grit. Victorian hygiene was a distant dream, and ingredients like flour and sugar were stored in open sacks, welcoming contributions from the dusty air. The tins were rarely washed properly, and the water used for steaming was of dubious origin. A certain sandy texture was not a flaw, it was a feature. The outer layer of the pudding, known as the skin, is a particular challenge, formed by hours of steaming against the side of a tin. It's a thick, rubbery, and almost indestructible barrier. Some considered it the best part, chewing on it with a determination born of hunger. Others saw it as the final, insurmountable obstacle between them and the sweet, starchy goodness. Within, it's chewy, occasionally singed, and peeling it off is out of the question. Despite these culinary quirks, the penny pudding was immensely popular. For a factory worker at the end of a long shift, or a street urchin with a found coin, a slice of hot pudding was the height of luxury. It was a potent combination of sugar and starch that provided an instant jolt of energy and a lasting feeling of fullness. It was comfort food in its most elemental form, a warm, sweet shield against the cold indifference of the city. Children especially adored them. They would pool their pennies to share a single slice, huddling together on a curb, licking the sticky treacle from their fingers and savoring every mouthful. Some vendors, feeling festive, might add a pinch of nutmeg or a splash of rum essence, transforming the humble pudding into a truly special treat. But even at its most basic, it was a source of profound joy. You finish your slice feeling warmer and fuller than you have all day. Your hunger has been vanquished, at least for now, by a dense, sticky, and slightly gritty slice of Victorian ingenuity. You survived, you're satisfied, and you only had to risk a little light indigestion and a potential chipped tooth in the grand calculus of street food. You've come out ahead. Your stomach, now fortified with warm, dense pudding, is ready for a new challenge. You wander to the far end of the market, where a different kind of vendor holds court. There are no steaming pots or sizzling griddles. Here instead, his stall is a strange and silent gallery of large glass jars, their contents floating mysteriously in a cloudy yellowish brine. The air here is sharp, filled with the eye-watering, sinus-clearing scent of vinegar. Welcome to the world of pickled delicacies, where preservation was an art form, and every bite was biological warfare. In an age without refrigeration, pickling was a necessity. It was a constant, ongoing battle against rot and decay, a way to make the fleeting bounty of summer last through the bleak, hungry months of winter. The principle was simple. Submerge something in an acidic brine, and it would last almost indefinitely. The practice, however, was far more adventurous. If it could fit in a jar, a Victorian would try to pickle it. You survey the offerings, a veritable museum of suspended animation. There's a jar of small pale onions, bobbing like ghostly eyeballs next to it, a collection of hard-boiled eggs, their whites turned a rubbery, translucent gray. A great glass urn contains what the vendor proudly calls pickled trotters, pigs' feet, their hooves pointing upwards in a state of eternal surprise. And at the end of the row, a jar of gherkins, so wrinkled and ancient, they look like they might possess ancient wisdom. The pickling liquid itself was a closely guarded secret, and for good reason. Real vinegar was expensive. So many vendors made their own acidic concoctions, from soured beer, old wine, and a healthy dose of skepticism. To this, they would add salt, often enough to mummify a small animal, and a handful of spices. For that extra visual appeal, some would add chemical color enhancers, a dash of copper sulfate, would keep the gherkins a pleasing, if unnatural shade of green, while other additives might be used to brighten the beets or onions. You decide to be brave and spend a halfpenny on a pickled egg. The vendor fishes one out of the murky brine with a long two-pronged fork and plops it into a piece of paper. The texture is unnervingly rubbery, and the smell of sharp, cheap vinegar is overpowering. You take a bite, the white is tough and squeaky against your teeth, and the yolk is a strange, crumbly texture with a dark, greenish-gray ring around the outside. The flavor is an assault on the senses. Intensely sour, ferociously salty, and with an underlying sulfuric note that makes your eyes water. Despite the shock to the system, these pickled foods were a beloved part of the Victorian diet. They provided a powerful, zesty counterpoint to the blandness of daily meals, which often consisted of little more than boiled meat and potatoes. A sharp pickled onion could liven up a dull meat pie, and a few slices of pickled cabbage could make a hunk of dry bread feel like a feast. It was a cheap and effective way to add a jolt of flavor to an otherwise monotonous menu. Children would dare each other to eat the sourest pickles, while adults would chase a pint of ale with a pickled whelk or a piece of gelatinous pig's trotter. It was a taste you either loved or loathed, but it was undeniably memorable. For many, the sharp tang of vinegar was the taste of home, a familiar flavor that brought a welcome brightness to the grayest of days. You finish the last of your rubbery sour egg, your taste buds screaming in a mixture of protest and confusion. You've just consumed something that has likely been sitting in a jar for months, preserved in a chemical bath of unknown origin. It was an experience you won't soon forget, for better or for worse. In the grand tapestry of Victorian cuisine, the pickle was a bold, sharp, and slightly dangerous thread. That pickled egg has left your mouth feeling like a salt mine. You are desperately thirsty, in need of something to wash away the lingering taste of brine and regret in Victorian England. Quenching your thirst is just as perilous as sating your hunger. You have options, but each comes with its own unique and inventive set of risks. You wander past a chemist's shop and are drawn in by a sign advertising the latest sensation, soda pop. Inside, a gleaming soda fountain promises effervescent refreshment. The soda jerk, a man in a crisp white coat, works the levers filling glasses with brightly colored, fizzing liquids. It's a vision of modern scientific progress. You see a turquoise blue, a shocking magenta, and a sunny yellow, each one bubbling with excitement. The flavors are just as exotic: pineapple sarsaparilla and a lemon soda that tastes more like a suggestion of citrus than the fruit itself. You order a glass of the lemon soda. The fizz is delightful, and the cold liquid is a shock to your system. But the flavor is intensely sweet with a sharp metallic aftertaste you can't quite place. That's because the vibrant colors are the same chemical dyes from the sweet shop, and the sharp zing might not be from lemons, but from a dash of sulfuric or tartaric acid. To enhance the fizziness, you're drinking a chemistry experiment, a sugary, bubbly concoction that values novelty far more than your well-being. But for most Victorians, the daily drink of choice isn't a novelty soda. It's beer in a city where the water is notoriously contaminated and often carries deadly diseases like cholera. A pint of ale is considered the safer, more wholesome option. The brewing process, it was believed, killed off the harmful germs. This was true to an extent, but it failed to account for the rampant adulteration that took place in the city's pubs and breweries. Brewers, like all Victorian entrepreneurs, were masters of stretching their profits. Hops, which give beer its characteristic bitter flavor, were expensive. To save money, many brewers used cheaper bittering agents, like quassia or even strychnine, a potent poison that in small doses added a desirable bitterness and a stimulating effect. To increase the beer's intoxicating power and keep customers coming back, some unscrupulous publicans were rumored to add salt to induce thirst, or even tobacco and opium derivatives. The beer itself was often a strange and inconsistent brew. The golden color might be enhanced with artificial dyes, and a frothy head could be created by adding alum or iron sulfate to the barrel. When you ordered a pint, you never quite knew what you were getting. It might be a decent, honest ale, or it might be a chemical cocktail designed to get you drunk faster and keep you drinking longer. Even children were not exempt. Weak, low-alcohol, small beer was considered a staple of a child's diet, often served with breakfast. It was seen as a safe and nutritious alternative to the dangerous city water. And so, from a young age, Victorians developed a taste for ale and a constitution capable of handling its many surprises. You finish your fizzy soda, the chemical sweetness clinging to your teeth. The choice was a difficult one. The known dangers of the river in a cup of water, or the unknown dangers of the brewery in a pint of ale. You chose the path of modern science, a brightly colored, fizzing glass of uncertainty. As you step back out into the street, your thirst is quenched, but a new question arises. What exactly did you just drink? The clock on the mantelpiece strikes 4. It is the most civilized hour of the Victorian day, a time for quiet reflection, polite conversation, and that most sacred of English rituals. Afternoon tea. You find yourself in a parlor, the fire crackling gently in the grate. A delicate porcelain teapot, painted with roses, sits on the table, its spout issuing a fragrant curl of steam. This surely is a safe harbor, a refuge of gentility, far from the chaos of the street vendors. But as the amber liquid fills your cup, you must remember, in this era danger wears many disguises, and sometimes it comes in a bone china cup. Let's begin with the tea itself. Genuine tea, imported from the distant shores of China and India, was a costly luxury. The demand was immense, and an army of unscrupulous merchants stood ready to meet it with a product that was often tea in name only. The most common fraud was to use leaves that had already been brewed once. These spent leaves were collected from hotels, restaurants, and wealthy homes, then re-dried, curled, and colored to look new again. To bolster these recycled leaves, or to create fake tea from scratch, merchants would mix in the dried leaves of other, more common plants, like sloe, elder, or ash, to give this motley collection of foliage the appearance of high-quality green or black tea. It was faced with a cocktail of toxic colorants. A dusting of Prussian blue and gypsum would create a convincing green tea, while black tea might be enhanced with black lead. This process left every cup of tea with a faint but discernible metallic aftertaste. Now for the sugar. In your host's finest silver bowl sits a pyramid of sparkling white sugar cubes, a symbol of prosperity and refinement. You take a pair of tiny tongs and drop a cube into your cup. You stir, waiting for it to dissolve, but it stubbornly resists, slowly disintegrating into a chalky cloud at the bottom of your cup. That's because your sugar cube might not be sugar at all. To imitate the expensive, refined product, some merchants sold compressed blocks of plaster of Paris or gypsum, lightly coated in real sugar, to fool the eye and the tongue. And we mustn't forget the milk sitting innocently in its porcelain jug. As we've already learned, this milk has likely been on a grand journey, refreshed with chalk diluted with water from a questionable pump, and possibly preserved with a dash of formaldehyde. As you pour it into your cup, you watch nervously to see if it curdles, a telltale sign that it has finally surrendered in its long battle against nature. Even the beautiful teapot is not without its secrets. The glaze that gives it that lovely smooth sheen could very well be made with lead. With every pot of boiling water, a minuscule amount of lead leaches into the tea, adding yet another layer of subtle, cumulative poison to this supposedly restorative ritual. Every single element on the tea tray, the leaves, the sugar, the milk, the pot, is a potential threat. You lift the cup to your lips, the warmth, a welcome comfort. You sip, trying to focus on the fragrant steam and the polite conversation. The tea tastes slightly of iron filings. The sugar has left a gritty residue, and the milk has a faint, chalky consistency. But you smile and compliment your host, because that is what is done. Afternoon tea was more than a drink. It was a performance of civilization. You finish your cup, a participant in this charming, elegant, and quietly lethal charade. You have survived the most refined part of the Victorian day, proving once again that in this era, from the gutter to the drawing room, every meal was an act of bravery, and every cup held a universe of secrets. The refined, if treacherous ritual of afternoon tea has passed, and a more primal hunger begins to stir. You find yourself back on the bustling streets, drawn by an aroma that is deeply and fundamentally savory. The smell of sizzling sausages at a butcher's stall, links hang in long, glistening rows, while a nearby vendor grills them over a charcoal fire, the fat spitting and popping in a hypnotic rhythm. A hot sausage, perhaps tucked into a bread roll, seems like the perfect hearty snack to ward off the evening chill. You approach the vendor, and for a few pennies you are handed a plump, sizzling sausage. It looks and smells delicious, a greasy, peppery promise of satisfaction. But as you prepare to take a bite, it's worth remembering that the Victorian sausage is the final destination for every part of an animal that couldn't be sold in a more respectable form. It is a masterpiece of thrift, ingenuity, and culinary concealment. The guiding principle of the Victorian butcher was to waste absolutely nothing, while the prime cuts of meat went to the dining tables of the wealthy. The rest of the animal, the bits and bobs, the odds and ends, was destined for the sausage grinder. The primary ingredient was offal, a charmingly blunt term for the internal organs: liver, lungs, heart, kidneys, and spleen. These were minced into a fine paste, forming the base of the sausage. To this, the butcher would add all the other scraps: connective tissue, skin, gristle, and any other offcuts that were left on the block. More alarmingly, the sausage was the perfect place to hide meat that was a day or two past its prime. If a joint of beef or mutton hadn't sold in time, it would be minced, heavily seasoned, and mixed in with the rest. Spices were a butcher's best friend. A heroic dose of black pepper, sage, and nutmeg could mask a multitude of sins, from a lack of quality to the first hints of decay. But even this collection of offal and aging meat wasn't enough to make the supply go further, and to create a plump, satisfying sausage. A huge amount of filler was added. Stale breadcrumbs were the most common, but so were oats, barley, and even mashed potatoes. It was not uncommon for a Victorian sausage to be less than 50% actual meat. It was, in essence, a tube of spiced, meat-flavored starch, held together with hope and animal fat. And what about the casing that held this dubious mixture together? Traditionally, they were made from cleaned animal intestines, but the term cleaned was applied with great leniency. A quick rinse in a bucket of cold water was often deemed sufficient. If you bit into a sausage and were met with a particularly tough or chewy casing, it was best not to ponder the reasons for too long. You take your first bite, the skin is snappy, and the inside is hot, fatty, and intensely peppery. The texture is soft, almost paste-like, with the occasional mysterious lump or bit of gristle. The flavor is overwhelmingly savory, but it's hard to identify any specific type of meat. It's just sausage, a singular, mysterious flavor category all its own. It's satisfying, but it also leaves you with a lingering sense of profound uncertainty. You finish the sausage, wiping the grease from your hands. Your hunger is gone, replaced by a feeling of heavy, if questionable, satisfaction. You have just consumed the ultimate culinary mystery box. Was it pork, beef, or a democratic assembly of every animal that had recently passed through the butcher's shop? You will never know, and in Victorian England you learned very quickly that some questions were better left unasked. After the heavy, greasy satisfaction of the sausage, your body craves something clean, light, and natural. A piece of fruit seems like the perfect antidote, a wholesome choice in a world of culinary corruption. You spot a costermonger with his barrow, a vibrant splash of color against the gray street pyramids of apples, pears, and oranges are stacked high, their surfaces gleaming invitingly in the fading afternoon light. This you think must surely be safe. It's fruit, after all, nature's own snack. You approach the barrow, admiring the seemingly perfect produce. The apples have a deep, red, waxy sheen, and the oranges glow with an almost impossible vibrancy. The vendor, sensing your interest, picks up an apple and polishes it vigorously on his sleeve, making it shine like a polished stone before offering it to you. It looks crisp, fresh, and utterly delicious. But that beautiful shine is the first layer of a subtle and grimy deception. That brilliant gleam on the apple isn't natural. It's the result of being polished with a rag that has likely seen more of the city's dirt than a street sweeper's broom. While the polish makes the fruit look appealing, it also transfers a fine layer of urban grime directly onto the skin you're about to eat. The vibrant color of the oranges might also be enhanced, with some vendors using chemical dyes, including lead-based ones, to make pale, unripe fruit look sweet and ready to eat. The costermonger is a master of presentation. The fruit is always arranged with its best side facing forward. The bruised, rotten, or worm-eaten parts are carefully hidden at the back of the barrow, or on the underside of the pyramid. You might buy what looks like a perfect pear, only to get it home and discover its other side is a soft, brown, decaying mess. It was a constant game of bait and switch, where the customer's optimism was the vendor's greatest asset. But the real danger wasn't necessarily in the fruit itself, but on its surface. In an age with little understanding of germ theory, and even less access to clean water, fruit was rarely, if ever, washed before being eaten. It had been handled by countless dirty hands on its journey from the orchard to the barrow, and it sat out in the open air all day, collecting dust, soot, and whatever else the London air had to offer. Any water used to freshen up leafy greens or vegetables was often scooped directly from the nearest pump, or worse, the Thames. You pay your penny for the gleaming apple. You're so tempted by its appearance that you bite into it right there. On the street, the first sensation is not the crisp snap you expected, but a soft, mealy texture. The flavor is bland and slightly woody. As you turn it in your hand, you see the dark, bruised patch the vendor so skillfully hid from view. There's also a faint, greasy film on the skin from the polishing rag, which leaves a strange aftertaste in your mouth. For the very poorest, the alternative to the costermonger's barrow was foraging, collecting fallen fruit from parks, or picking berries from hedgerows. This too had its risks, from eating fruit contaminated by animal waste to the ever-present danger of misidentifying a harmless berry and picking something poisonous. Instead, you finish your disappointing apple, tossing the core into the gutter. Your attempt to find a healthy, natural snack has only reinforced the bleak reality of the Victorian foodscape in this city. Even the simplest gifts of the earth were touched by deception and danger. The beautiful, shining apple was just another lie, a reminder that in the relentless pursuit of a penny, nothing, not even nature, was allowed to remain pure and simple. Still hungry after the disappointing apple, you search for something truly reliable. Something cheap, filling, and honest. Your eyes land on a vendor standing over a portable cast-iron oven, a warm glow emanating from its open door. The comforting, earthy smell of baked potatoes wafts towards you. Here, finally, is a food without pretense. The humble potato, the bedrock of the working-class diet, surely holds no secrets or dangers. The vendor, using a pair of thick gloves, pulls a large, floury potato from the oven. Its skin is crisp and dark with ash, and when he splits it open, a cloud of fluffy white steam billows into the chilly air. For a penny, he adds a sprinkle of salt from a communal shaker, and for an extra halfpenny, a small pat of glistening butter. It feels like the safest, most wholesome meal you could buy on the street. Potatoes were the fuel that powered industrial Britain. They were cheap to grow, easy to store, and packed with the calories needed to endure a day of hard labor. For millions, a hot potato was not just a snack, but a full meal, a small mercy in a life of constant toil. But even this simple staple was not without its own peculiar set of Victorian hazards. You take your first bite. It's hot, fluffy, and salty, deeply satisfying. But as you get closer to the skin, you notice a distinct bitterness, and see that the flesh has a pale greenish hue. This is the telltale sign of solanine, a mild toxin that develops in potatoes that are old or have been exposed to too much light. Most Victorians were unaware of the cause, but they were familiar with the symptoms. A strange tingling or numbness in the mouth, and in larger doses, stomach cramps and nausea. Then there is the matter of the butter. In a world without refrigeration, dairy products were a constant gamble. The butter melting into your potato might have been fresh that morning, but it could just as easily be on the verge of turning rancid, adding a sharp, cheesy Thames that was definitely not part of the intended flavor profile. Any fat or dripping used by the vendor was likely of a similar, questionable vintage, ladled from a pot that had been simmering for days. Hygiene, as always, was an afterthought. The potato was likely pulled from the earth, stored in a damp cellar, and cooked and served by a vendor who hadn't washed his hands all day. Any dirt or bacteria clinging to the skin was simply cooked along with it. The salt was available for all to pinch, and any other toppings, like a spoonful of sad, overboiled cabbage, had been sitting out in the open air for hours. Despite these risks, the hot potato was one of the better bets on the street. It was nutritious, it was hot enough to kill some of the surface germs, and its contents were not a mystery. You knew you were eating a potato, which was a level of certainty you couldn't get from a sausage or a pie. A numb tongue was considered a small price to pay for a reliably full stomach. You finish your potato, the warmth spreading through you. Your mouth is tingling slightly from the solanine, and the taste of slightly off butter lingers on your palate. But you are no longer hungry. You feel grounded and ready to face the next challenge. You have eaten a meal that was exactly what it appeared to be, more or less. In the deceptive world of Victorian street food, that small amount of honesty feels like a triumph. The piercing shriek of a factory whistle cuts through the thunderous din of machinery, signaling the arrival of the midday break. The clattering looms and grinding gears fall silent, replaced by the weary sighs and shuffling feet of hundreds of workers. You wipe a layer of grime and grease from your hands onto your trousers and find a spot on a cold stone. Step 4. The most anticipated and often most disappointing moment of the day. Lunch. There is no cafeteria, no clean table, just a brief 30-minute truce in the war against the clock. You pull out a small bundle wrapped in a piece of cloth that was clean this morning but is now smudged with soot. This meal wasn't bought from a vendor. It was packed at dawn and has spent the last 5 hours aging in the lint-filled warmth of your pocket. Its survival of the morning commute is your first culinary victory of the day. You unwrap the bundle. Inside sits the cornerstone of the Victorian worker's lunch, a sandwich. But this is no proud, generously filled creation. It consists of 2 thick slices of that familiar brick-like bread we've come to know and fear. The bread is dry, dense, and has absorbed the faint, musty taste of your coat pocket. Between the slices lies the day's meager filling. If you're fortunate, there's a thin smear of dripping the rendered fat from last Sunday's roast, which has now congealed into a waxy, translucent layer. On a truly good day, there might be a sliver of sharp, sweaty cheese, or a single slice of ham, so thin you can practically see the grime of the factory floor through it. More often than not, the filling is simply a scrape of cheap jam or treacle. Its sweetness a stark and slightly desperate contrast to the savory dust that coats everything. As you begin to eat, the factory itself adds its own unique seasoning. A fine powder of coal, dust, and cotton fibers drifts through the air, settling on your bread like a dark, gritty pepper. The metallic temps of machine oil is a constant presence, a flavor that infuses every bite. You eat with your hands, which, despite your best efforts, are still stained with the grease and dirt of your labor, transferring the taste of the workshop directly to your meal. You wash this down with a swig of cold tea from a tin flask. The tea was brewed hours ago and has since stewed into a bitter, tannin-rich liquid. It's lukewarm and tastes faintly of tin, but it is wet and it is safer than drinking from the communal water pump outside around. You other workers are doing the same, hunched over their own sad bundles, eating quickly and mechanically. There is a quiet camaraderie in this shared ritual of survival, a silent understanding of the grim necessity of the meal. Sometimes a friend might trade a piece of pickled onion for a bite of your sandwich, a small act of generosity in a harsh world. But mostly you eat alone with your thoughts, the brief silence of the factory floor, a stark reminder of the noise that is about to return. There is no pleasure here, only fuel. You are a machine, and this is your ration of low-grade coal to keep the engine running for another few hours. The whistle shrieks again, a cruel and impatient sound. The break is over. You swallow the last dry, gritty mouthful, wrap up your cloth, and rise to your feet. Your stomach is full, but you feel no satisfaction, only a heavy resignation. The afternoon stretches before you, and you can only hope that the headache that is beginning to form is from the noise of the factory and not from the questionable contents of your lunch. Escaping the relentless grind of the factory, you find yourself drawn to the distant sounds of music and laughter. It's a traveling fair, a rare and chaotic festival of noise, light, and fleeting joy that has set up in a muddy field on the edge of town. You step onto the fairground, and your senses are immediately overwhelmed. The air is thick with the smell of sawdust, hot sugar, frying lard, and the unmistakable aroma of impending indigestion. This is not a place for caution. It is a place for indulgence, no matter the cost. The food is the heart of the spectacle, a collection of treats designed to be as bright, sweet, and exciting as the fair itself. Your eyes are immediately drawn to the toffee apples hanging in glistening red rows. They look like giant rubies on a stick, the perfect decadent treat. You buy one, and the first bite is a battle. The toffee, made from cheap sugar and red dye, has hardened into a glassy shell that threatens to shatter your teeth if you succeed in breaking through. Your reward is the apple beneath, a sad, mealy specimen that is often bruised and has a distinctly vinegary taste, having been well past its prime before its sugary embalming. Nearby, a vendor is spinning fairy floss, what we now call candy floss, into giant, fluffy clouds of pink and blue. It looks magical, an edible piece of the sky, but the sugar is colored with the same familiar chemical dyes, and as it spins in the open air, the sticky threads act as a net catching dust, stray hairs, and the occasional unlucky insect. You eat a mouthful of sweet, airy nothingness that melts on your tongue, trying to ignore the slightly gritty texture. The savory stalls are even more of a gamble. The irresistible smell of fried dough wafts from a tent, where a woman is dropping lumps of batter into a vat of bubbling lard. These fritters, or donuts, emerge golden brown and are immediately dusted with sugar. The lard, however, has likely not been changed all day or possibly all week, and carries the ghostly flavors of everything that has been cooked in it. The result is a heavy, grease-soaked pastry that is often still raw and doughy in the middle. Of course, the familiar sausage and pie men are here as well, their standards, if it's possible, even lower than on the city streets. In the chaotic, temporary environment of the fair, oversight is non-existent. The mystery of the meat is deeper than ever, and the gravy is thick with secrets. A pork pie bought at a fair might contain a wobbly layer of aspic, so firm and clear it looks like decorative glass, a testament to the strange chemistry of Victorian food preservation. Despite the obvious risks, everyone is eating with gusto. For many, a trip to the fair is a rare escape from a life of hardship, and the food is a central part of the fantasy. The joy is infectious. Children, their faces sticky with sugar, beg their parents for one more treat, while adults wash down questionable meat pies with frothy mugs of ale. The collective understanding is that a stomach ache is simply the price of admission. As the day ends, you stumble away from the fair, your pockets empty and your hands sticky. Your stomach has begun to issue the first low rumbles of protest, a gentle warning of the battle to come. The bright lights and happy music fade behind you, leaving you with the memories of a day of thrilling, reckless fun. The fair was an adventure for the senses, and now, as you head home, you are about to embark on the final adventure of the day, surviving the consequences. Let's shrink our perspective now down to the eye level of a Victorian child. Imagine you are no more than 10 years old, and you've just come into a fortune. A single halfpenny, a small worn copper coin warm from your hand. In your world, this coin is a key to a kingdom of untold delights. You run to the corner sweet shop, a place of magic and impossible choices, your mind racing with the possibilities that this tiny amount of money can unlock. The world of childhood snacking is governed by a different economy. It's a world of farthings and halfpennies, where the goal is to get the most sugar, the brightest color, and the longest-lasting treat for the smallest possible price. The shopkeeper, wise to the desires of his small customers, has jars filled with cheap and cheerful sweets, designed specifically for you: bullseyes, hard-boiled peppermint swirls, licorice pipes that let you pretend to be a grown-up, and tiny sugar mice with string tails. You make your choice. A small paper twist of licorice, the shopkeeper scoops them from a large glass jar with his bare hands, hands that have just handled money, patted the shopcat. The concept of hygiene is an adult concern you have yet to learn. You are simply overjoyed to receive your prize, a small bag of black, chewy treasure that smells intensely of aniseed and sugar. As with all Victorian sweets, what you see is not entirely what you get. The licorice is black, not from the root, but from industrial grade carbon black coloring. Its chewiness is enhanced with starches, and its sweetness is stretched with cheap syrups. The bullseyes in the next jar are mostly peppermint flavor and chalk dust, and the acid drops are so intensely sour because they are made with tartaric acid, which could strip the enamel from your teeth. But these sweets are more than just a snack. They are a form of social currency in the schoolyard or the alleyway. You trade a licorice stick for a bullseye. You dare a friend to crunch through a jawbreaker. You see whose tongue can be stained the most unnatural color. These cheap, hazardous treats are the building blocks of childhood. Friendships, rivalries, and hierarchies, they are a source of joy, a subject of intense debate, and a way to claim a small piece of the world for yourself. When money is even tighter, a snack can be a much simpler, grimmer affair. It might be a slice of bread spread with a thin layer of lard and a sprinkle of sugar. In winter, a roasted chestnut bought from a street vendor and held in your hands to warm them is a rare luxury for the poorest children. A snack might be whatever can be foraged: a fallen apple from a wealthy family's garden, or wild berries picked from a hedgerow, a gamble on whether they are sweet or sickening. You chew on your licorice, the intense, slightly chemical flavor flooding your senses. It's gritty, you notice, as if it contains a little sand from the bottom of the jar, but you don't care. This is your treat, bought with your money. It is a moment of pure, sweet autonomy in a world where you have very little control. It is a small rebellion, a tiny act of self-indulgence in a life that is often gray and difficult. You make the treat last as long as possible, nibbling at the edges, savoring every bit. The sugar rush is a welcome jolt of energy. The stomach ache that might follow a few hours later is a familiar, if unwelcome, consequence. This is the reality of a Victorian childhood, learning to navigate a world of small, dangerous pleasures, developing a constitution of iron, one gritty, toxic, but joyful halfpenny treat at a time. Let's step away from the fleeting world of street food and into the more permanent collection of goods in a Victorian grocer's shop. Here, lining the dusty shelves, is a testament to the era's technological ambition. Preserved foods, tins of meat, jars of fruit, and bottles of pickles promise a future free from the tyranny of the seasons. You can have salmon in winter and beef stew on a moment's notice. It is a modern miracle of convenience. But each tin and jar is also a small, sealed mystery, a gamble on science over nature. The star of this revolution is the tin can. These are not the lightweight, easy-open cans of today. A Victorian tin is a heavy, formidable object crafted from thick iron and sealed with a generous seam of lead-based solder. Its label, often beautifully illustrated, promises a delicious and wholesome meal within. However, that lead solder The very thing keeping the can sealed is slowly and steadily leaching into the food, imparting a subtle metallic flavor and a less subtle dose of heavy metal poison. Opening one of these tins is a battle of wills. The can opener has not yet been widely adopted, so the task requires a hammer and chisel, or a large, sturdy knife. You place the can on a wooden block and carefully puncture the lid, praying the contents don't erupt under the pressure of unseen fermentation. Sometimes a can would be a blower, its lid swollen and convex from the gases produced by the bacteria multiplying within an experienced housekeeper. This was a sign of deadly botulism, but a less wary person might see it as just another household adventure. If you succeed in opening the can without injury, you are greeted with the contents. Tinned beef is often a single, pale, spongy mass swimming in a pool of gelatinous fat. Tinned salmon flakes apart, its color strangely preserved, but its texture soft and watery. The overriding taste is often one of salt and tin, a metallic temps that no amount of seasoning can fully disguise. You are eating not just the food, but a taste of the industrial process that created it. Preserved fruits in glass jars offer a different set of challenges. A layer of wax or a tightly tied cloth was often the only thing standing between the fruit and the outside world. If the seal was imperfect, mold would creep in, forming a fuzzy blanket over the plums or cherries. Suspended in their thick syrup, it was also not uncommon to find that a few insects had been sealed in along with the fruit. Their perfectly preserved bodies adding a bit of unexpected crunch, and as the ever-practical Victorians might say, extra protein. Every family had a horror story about preserved goods: the Christmas pudding that was ruined when the tinned cherries turned out to be a fizzy alcoholic mush, the picnic that was abruptly cancelled after opening a tin of sardines that smelled less of the sea and more of a chemical spill. You learned to approach every tin with suspicion, to tap the lid, to sniff the contents cautiously, and to never, ever eat anything from a can that hissed at you when you opened it. Despite the risks, these preserved foods were treasured for a family in a cramped city tenement. They offered a taste of luxury and variety that would have been impossible just a generation earlier. A jar of peaches in the dead of winter was a miracle. A tin of beef could save a meal when there was no fresh meat to be had. It was the promise of progress sealed in a can. You pry open a tin of mutton, the metal groaning in protest. The contents look strange and pale, but they smell edible. You have successfully navigated the first hurdle of modern convenience. The danger was no longer out on the street. It was right here in your own pantry, a quiet, patient threat waiting to be opened. Let's return to the breakfast table, where a simple meal of tea and toast is about to be elevated by a dollop of jam from a brightly labeled jar. The jam glows a deep, inviting ruby red, promising the sweet, sun-ripened taste of fresh strawberries or raspberries. It is a splash of vibrant, cheerful color on a gray morning, a small luxury to make the day feel a little brighter. You dip your knife in admiring the glossy sheen. But this is Victorian England, where even the sweetest things have a dark and deceptive heart. The truth is, the contents of that jar have likely never been anywhere near a strawberry patch. Real fruit was expensive, and the profit margins on jam were slim. So Victorian jam manufacturers became masters of botanical illusion. The rich red pulp that looks so much like crushed berries was often created from a base of much cheaper and less flavorful vegetables. Mashed turnips, carrots, and beetroots were boiled down into a thick, indistinct mush that formed the bulk of the product. To create the illusion of real fruit, clever manufacturers would employ a variety of tricks. A handful of real fruit might be thrown into the vat to lend a faint, authentic aroma to the boiling vegetable slurry, to mimic the texture of raspberry or strawberry jam. They would sometimes stir in small, cheap seeds, like timothy, grass seed, which looked convincing enough to the unsuspecting eye. The whole concoction was then thickened with gelatin, often derived from boiled animal hooves, to give it that perfect, spreadable consistency. The brilliant, jewel-like color was the final and most important part of the deception. Sometimes this was achieved with harmless beetroot juice, but more often it came from the same arsenal of industrial dyes used in the candy industry. Cochineal, derived from crushed insects, provided a vibrant red, but so did more modern and hazardous coal tar dyes, which could cause rashes and other unpleasant reactions. The goal was to create a product that looked so convincingly like real fruit jam that no one would question the slightly strange, vegetable-like aftertaste. You spread the jam on your slice of chalky bread. You notice immediately that the texture is wrong. It's smooth in some places, but strangely lumpy in others, and it lacks the fibrous quality of real fruit. You take a bite. The flavor is one-dimensional, an overwhelming, cloying sweetness from the enormous amount of cheap sugar used to mask the taste of the turnip base. There's a faint hint of something fruity, but it's a distant, ghostly echo, quickly drowned out by the sugary onslaught. As you eat, you might encounter a small, hard lump. Is it a piece of fruit? Or is it a splinter from one of the massive wooden vats where the jam was boiled and stirred with paddles the size of boat oars? Insects, attracted by the sweet smell, were also a common ingredient, their bodies adding a bit of unexpected texture to the final product. Every jar was a lottery. Despite the widespread fraud, jam was adored. It was a cheap and easy way to make a plain piece of bread feel like a treat. Children begged for it, spreading it thickly on their toast, blissfully unaware that they were eating sweetened, colored turnips. The vibrant color and intense sweetness were all that mattered. It was a taste of luxury, even if the luxury itself was a complete fabrication. You finish your toast, the sweet, slightly chemical taste of the jam lingering in your mouth. You have just experienced one of the great culinary confidence tricks of the age. The dream of summer berries, so beautifully promised on the jar's label, was just that. A dream sold for a few pennies to a population hungry for any small taste of sweetness they could get. Your culinary journey now takes you to one of the most pungent and revered corners of the Victorian grocer's shop, the cheese counter. This is less a display and more a living museum of microbiology. Great wheels of cheddar and Cheshire sit on wooden planks in the cool, damp air, their rinds thick and mottled with age. The air is heavy with the sharp, earthy, and slightly funky aroma of fermentation. Cheese was a cornerstone of the Victorian diet, a vital source of fat and protein. But every wedge was a gamble on the fine line between aged and spoiled. The grocer, wiping his hands on an apron that has seen better centuries, offers you a taste. He cuts a sliver from a large, crumbly wheel, marbled with dark blue veins. "That's where the flavor is," he says, with a knowing wink, as if the mold is a secret gourmet ingredient. And perhaps it was in an age before sterile production facilities. The unique character of a cheese was often the result of the specific molds and bacteria that happened to colonize it in the cellar. The journey of the cheese began, of course, with the milk, the same questionable, often adulterated liquid we've already encountered. This milk was curdled, pressed, and salted, then left to age for months or even years in conditions that were ideal for developing complex flavors and a host of uninvited guests. These cellars were home to more than just cheese. They were ecosystems of mites, insects, and rodents, all of whom were happy to sample the wares. This led to the creation of delicacies that would terrify a modern health inspector. Mighty cheese was a well-known variety, a cheese that had been intentionally left for tiny cheese mites to burrow through. These creatures would consume the cheese and their digestive processes would break down the fats and proteins, creating a uniquely sharp, pungent flavor and a dusty, powdered rind. For some, it was the height of gourmet adventure. For others, it was simply an infested food. And then there were the maggots. If a wheel was cracked or improperly stored, flies could lay their eggs, resulting in a cheese that was quite literally crawling. The pragmatic Victorian response was not to throw the whole thing out. That would be wasteful. Instead, the most visibly inhabited sections were simply scraped off, and the rest of the cheese was sold and eaten with the hope that any remaining larvae would add more protein than problems. You take the sliver of blue-veined cheese the grocer offered. The smell is so powerful, it makes your eyes water. You place it on your tongue. The flavor is an explosion. Intensely sharp, salty, creamy, and with a peppery metallic finish from the mold. The texture is crumbly and melts in your mouth. You can't decide if it's the most delicious or the most horrifying thing you've ever tasted. Despite these hazards, cheese was a beloved and essential food. A hunk of strong cheddar with a slice of that chalky bread and a pickled onion was a classic. Working man's lunch, a plowman's meal that was cheap, filling, and packed with flavor. Even the poorest families would keep a small piece of cheese, carefully wrapped to be grated over potatoes or melted on toast, its powerful taste able to transform a bland meal into something special. You decide to buy a small wedge of the mysterious, pungent cheese. The grocer wraps it in a piece of muslin, and you tuck it into your bag, a small, edible time bomb of flavor and bacteria. It might be the centerpiece of a delicious meal, or it might be a midnight trip to the privy. In the world of Victorian cheese, every purchase was an act of faith, a belief that the flavor would be worth the formidable risk. The long day is finally over, and the thought of returning to your cold room to gnaw on a piece of chalky bread is deeply unappealing. You decide to treat yourself with a few precious pennies clutched in your hand. You push open the door to a working-class eating house, the Victorian equivalent of a greasy spoon diner. A blast of warm, damp air hits you thick with the intermingled smells of boiled cabbage, stale beer, and generations of fried fat. The room is small and crowded. A haze of steam and smoke hangs in the air, fogging the windows and casting a grimy halo around the single, sputtering gas lamp. You find a space at a long wooden table, its surface sticky to the touch, and survey the scene. The floor is covered in sawdust, a practical measure to soak up spilled ale and other, less identifiable fluids. Your fellow diners are laborers and factory workers, hunched over their bowls, eating with a silent, focused intensity. This is not a place for conversation. It is a place for refueling. The menu is a simple, choke-written board on the wall, but you opt for the house special. The stew, it's the cheapest, hottest, and most filling thing on offer. The proprietor, a large woman with an apron of indeterminate color and a permanent scowl, ladles a helping into a chipped porcelain bowl and thumps it down in front of you. A thick slice of die-old bread is served alongside it. You peer into the bowl. The stew is a thick, brown, bubbling substance with a rainbow sheen of grease floating on its surface. Chunks of something that might be meat jostle with overboiled potatoes, and the occasional ghostly pale turnip. A single limp carrot slice floats by like a piece of wreckage. You are not meant to identify the ingredients. You are meant to be grateful that they are hot. The meat is likely the cheapest, toughest cuts of mutton, or perhaps the odds and ends from the local butcher, all boiled for hours, until they reach a state of complete submission. You pick up the spoon. It's a battered, slightly bent piece of tin that feels thin in your hand. Like the bowl, it has been washed in a communal basin of lukewarm, greasy water in the back, a process that likely redistributes germs more than it removes them. You take your first mouthful of stew. It is hot, salty, and has a thick, floury texture. The meat is stringy and tasteless, its character long since boiled away, leaving only its texture behind. This is a meal of grim necessity. The bread is too hard to bite, so you use it as a tool, tearing off pieces to mop up the thick, greasy gravy. If there's a bottle of vinegar on the table, you use it liberally, its sharp acidity cutting through the fat and masking any flavors that might be too questionable. You eat quickly without thinking, your eyes fixed on your bowl. There is an unspoken contract. In a place like this, you pay your pennies, and in return, you get a hot meal that will fill your belly and see you through to the morning the proprietor provides. The calories, and you, the customer, provide a willful sense of ignorance. You do not ask what part of the animal the meat came from, or how many days this stew has been simmering on the stove. To ask would be to break the fragile truce that makes this transaction possible. You finish the last of your meal, scraping the bowl clean with the last of your bread. You feel heavy and full, a sensation that is both comforting and slightly alarming. You pay your bill and step back out into the foggy night air. You have successfully dined out. It was not a pleasure, but a necessity, another calculated risk in a life filled with them. Your stomach is full, and now you can only hope it decides to be peaceful for the rest of the night. As evening descends, casting long shadows down the foggy alleyways, you hear a familiar sound, the ringing of a small handbell and a musical cry that cuts through the din of the city. It's the pie man, a figure of legend in the Victorian culinary landscape. You've already sampled a street pie, but now you understand that there are pies, and then there are the creations of these notorious masters of the tradesmen, whose names were whispered in pubs with a mixture of dread and grudging admiration. The pie man is more than a vendor. He is a performer. He pushes a small portable oven on wheels, a plume of steam and savory smoke trailing behind him like a magician's cloak. His sales pitch is a well-rehearsed piece of theater, promising the finest beef, the most succulent kidney, the flakiest crust. But everyone knows the truth, or at least they think they do. Eating a pie from a famous pie man isn't just lunch. It's an act of defiance, a dare against your own digestive system. Let's talk again about that crust. We know it was often padded with chalk or sawdust, but the fat used to bind it together was a crucial and often horrifying element. The cheapest, most rancid lard was used, giving the pastry a distinctive, slightly sour taste that was often mistaken for a secret spice blend. The goal was to create something that looked golden and inviting, even if the taste and texture were closer to a roofing tile held together with stale grease. But it is the filling that is the stuff of urban legend. The rumors went far beyond the simple use of stray cats and dogs. Darker tales, fueled by the popular penny, dreadful horror stories of the day, whispered of pies containing the flesh of rats from the sewers, or even more unspeakable things, while the most sensational stories, like those of Sweeney Todd, were fiction. they were born from a very real and pervasive public anxiety about the complete lack of transparency in the food chain. The term mutton pie became a running joke in the city. Londoners would say that the only thing you could be certain of when buying a mutton pie was that it contained absolutely no mutton. The filling was more likely to be horse meat, cheap and plentiful, or a democratic assembly of any and every kind of animal, offal. The pie man could acquire from the back doors of the city's slaughterhouses. The great unifier, the ultimate tool of concealment, was the gravy. It was always thick, dark, and so heavily seasoned with pepper that it would numb the tongue. Its purpose was twofold: to bind together the disparate and often unappetizing collection of minced scraps into a cohesive whole, and to completely overwhelm the palate of the consumer. If you couldn't taste the individual ingredients, you couldn't question what they were. The gravy was a delicious, peppery shroud, hiding a multitude of sins. And yet the people kept buying. The pie man's bell was an irresistible summons to the hungry and the cold. There was an unspoken agreement between vendor and customer. He would provide a hot, cheap, and deeply savory meal, and they would provide their willful ignorance. Everyone had a story about a friend who found a button or a tuft of fur in their pie. But these tales were told with a kind of grim pride, a testament to the toughness of the city's inhabitants. You see a pie man, now his cart illuminated by a flickering gas lamp. The steam rises into the foggy air, and despite everything you know, despite all the horrific tales, you feel a pang of hunger. The allure of a hot, savory pie on a cold night is a powerful magic, a temptation that proved for millions of Victorians to be worth the terrifying risk. After this long and perilous journey through the Victorian snackscape, a single nagging question must be echoing in your mind. How did anyone survive? We've encountered bread bulked out with plaster sweets colored with arsenic, milk preserved with formaldehyde, and pies of unimaginable mystery. By all modern logic, the population of London should have been decimated by their own lunch. And yet millions of people navigated this culinary minefield every single day. The answer lies in one of the unsung marvels of the age: the ironclad resilience of the Victorian digestive tract. This was not the sensitive, carefully managed stomach of today. It was a battle-hardened veteran, a biological fortress, forged in the fires of necessity and seasoned with a daily dose of low-grade poison. From the earliest age, it was trained to expect the unexpected and to process the unprocessable. In a grim sense, it was a matter of survival. Of the toughest children were weaned on the same adulterated foods as their parents. The chalky milk and gritty bread were their first solid foods. This early and constant exposure meant that those with weaker constitutions often succumbed to the endless array of digestive ailments that plagued the city. Those who survived, however, developed a remarkable tolerance, their bodies learning to cope with substances that would send a modern person rushing to the emergency room. This resilience was bolstered by a profound lack of alternatives. You could not simply choose to eat organic, untainted food. It didn't exist. You ate the bread the baker sold. You drank the milk the milkman delivered, and you were grateful for it. Over time, the strange and alarming qualities of the food became normalized. A metallic tang in your tea or a slightly fizzy quality in your dairy was not a sign of danger, but simply the way things were. The human palate and the human gut adapted. We must also remember the role of blissful ignorance. The germ theory of disease was still a radical new idea for much of the era. Most people attributed sickness not to invisible microbes in their food, but to miasma, bad air, or simply to a person's own weak moral or physical character, without the knowledge that their food was actively trying to kill them. They could eat with a confidence that, while misplaced, was undoubtedly a powerful psychological shield. When sickness inevitably struck, Victorians turned to a vast and bewildering array of remedies. Apothecaries did a roaring trade in digestive tonics and stomach settlers, which were often dubious concoctions of alcohol, opium, and other narcotics that would numb the pain without addressing the cause. Every family had its own secret cure for an upset stomach, a foul-tasting herbal brew passed down through generations. In a strange way, this ability to endure became a source of pride. Working-class men would boast about their capacity to handle the most notorious street pies. Grandmothers would tell stories of eating cheese so old it was practically a pet. The ability to digest the indigestible was seen as a sign of strength, a mark of a true Londoner who was too tough to be taken down by a mere piece of questionable mutton. So as you lie here contemplating this parade of horrors from the safety of the modern world, take a moment to appreciate the sheer, stubborn tenacity of the human body. The Victorians survived, not because their food was safe, but because they were tough. Their stomachs were not just organs. They were unsung heroes of the Industrial Revolution, quietly and miraculously turning poison into fuel day after grueling day. Let's return to the beginning, to the cold gray light of a Victorian dawn. Before the pies and the pickles, before the candies and the cheese, the first and most fundamental challenge of the day presented itself. Breakfast. This was not a meal of leisure or pleasure. It was a grim, hurried ritual of fueling the body for the onslaught to come, and the assault on your digestive system began with the very first bite. You are in a chilly kitchen, the embers of last night's fire barely glowing. The first task is to confront the bread, that familiar brick-like loaf sitting in its bin. You take a knife and saw off a thick slice. The crumbs scattering like chalk dust. You know by now that its satisfying weight comes from plaster and its whiteness from alum. It is less a foodstuff and more a piece of edible architecture, a testament to the baker's deceptive art. Next, the porridge for many. This was the daily staple, a supposedly wholesome and filling meal. But this is not the creamy, comforting oatmeal of the modern age. It is a thin, watery gruel made from the cheapest, lowest-grade oats or barley, often containing a fair amount of grit and chaff. It is cooked in a single, all-purpose iron pot that is rarely scrubbed clean, and so each morning's batch inherits the faint, smoky, and slightly metallic ghost of 100 previous meals. To wash this down, there is tea. The leaves in the teapot are pale and exhausted, likely on their third or fourth use. They are supplemented with dried, slow leaves to add bulk and colored with a pinch of black lead to restore a convincing dark hue. The resulting brew is weak, bitter, and tastes faintly of the tin mug you drink it from. You add a splash of that chalky, watered-down milk and a spoonful of gritty brown sugar, hoping the sweetness will mask the other flavors. If you are feeling particularly prosperous, you might add a touch of luxury to this bleak meal. A scrape of cold bacon fat or dripping might be spread on your bread, though its rancid, waxy taste is a gamble. A boiled egg might be on offer, though it's likely to be several days old, its yolk pale and its white unsettlingly rubbery. Every addition meant to be a treat brings with it a fresh set of potential hazards. Even the tools you use to eat are part of the conspiracy. Your spoon may be made of pewter, a soft alloy that contains lead, which leaches into your hot porridge with every scrape, the glaze on your earthenware. Mug is also likely lead-based, adding its own slow cumulative poison to your weak tea. You are consuming not just adulterated food, but the very dishware it is served on. Yet you eat without complaint in the Victorian mindset, skipping breakfast was a far greater folly than eating a questionable one. The long day of labor ahead demanded calories, no matter their source. Parents would watch their children hawk-eyed, ensuring they finished every last gritty spoonful of porridge. An empty stomach was a weakness the city would mercilessly exploit. So, you finish your meal, you have consumed bread, porridge, and tea, a trinity of deception. Your body has been filled, if not truly nourished. You have successfully completed the first and most important gamble of the day. As you step out of your door and into the smoggy morning, you are armed with the grim satisfaction of knowing that if your breakfast couldn't defeat you, nothing else stood a chance. Let us travel now to the very source of so much of London's life and death. The banks of the River Thames. The air here is thick and heavy, a unique perfume of low-tide coal smoke and raw sewage. The river itself is not a sparkling, picturesque waterway. It is a sluggish brown beast, the city's great artery and its open sewer. And yet, from these foul and murky depths, an astonishing bounty was pulled every day, most famously the oyster. Lining the riverbanks, you see the oystermen at their stalls. Wicker baskets are piled high with the rough gray shells, glistening with river water. For a penny you can buy a dozen. In the Victorian-era, oysters were not the expensive luxury they are today. They were the opposite. The cheapest, most plentiful source of protein available, the food of the poor, the desperate, and the daring. They were so abundant that they were used as filler in meat pies, or simply eaten by the shovelful. An oysterman, his hands and apron perpetually damp, selects a shell for you. With a flick of his wrist, he expertly pries it open with a short, stout knife, revealing the pale, quivering flesh within. He offers it to you on the half-shell, along with a bottle of vinegar and a shaker of pepper. This is street food at its most elemental, raw, immediate, and profoundly dangerous. The danger, of course, came from the river oysters, our filter feeders, meaning they pump vast quantities of water through their bodies, trapping and consuming any particles they find in the polluted Thames. This meant they were not just filtering algae, they were concentrating a toxic soup of industrial waste, human effluent, and the bacteria responsible for the era's most feared diseases, typhoid and cholera. Every oyster was a tiny, perfectly packaged dose of the river's filth. You take the shell, douse the oyster in vinegar, a desperate, hopeful act of self-preservation, and tip your head back. The oyster slides down your throat in a single, cold, slimy, and briny gulp. The taste is of salt metal and the unmistakable murky flavor of the Thames itself. It is the taste of survival, a quick and easy meal in a world that offered few. You look around at your fellow diners. A group of ragged children are pooling their pennies to share a few, slurping them down with joyful abandon. A clerk on his lunch break is methodically working his way through a plateful, his face impassive. The oyster stalls were a great social equalizer. Rich and poor alike came to the riverbank to partake in its cheap, if hazardous, bounty. The risk was universally understood, even if the science was not. Everyone knew someone who had been struck down by a summer fever after a feast of shellfish. Illness was simply accepted as part of the bargain. If you survived, you could boast of your strong stomach. If you didn't, well, there were always more hungry Londoners waiting to take your place at the stall. You stand by the river, the aftertaste of brine and vinegar sharp in your mouth. You have just played the most direct and dangerous game of culinary roulette the city has to offer. Was that a cheap, nutritious meal, or was it a fatal mistake? There is no way to know. You can only walk away from the riverbank, hoping for the best, and wait for your own resilient, ironclad stomach to deliver the verdict. And so, here we are. We have traveled from the first gray light of dawn to the deep, foggy gloom of a London night. We have navigated a relentless gauntlet of culinary horrors, a full day's menu of deception and danger. We have breakfasted on chalk and tea of questionable origin, lunched on pies of profound mystery, and supped on stew from a communal pot of secrets. We have snacked on poison, quenched our thirst with chemicals, and placed our faith in the flimsy promises of 100 different street vendors, and we have survived. Take a moment in the quiet of your own space to appreciate that fact. Your journey through the Victorian underbelly is over, and your imaginary digestive system has somehow weathered the storm. It has processed, plastered, neutralized arsenic, and battled bacteria that would send a modern physician into a state of panic. It has proven itself to be as resilient and as stubborn as the Victorians themselves, who performed this incredible feat not for a single imaginary day, but for their entire lives. The story of their food is the story of their world, a place of incredible innovation and terrifying negligence of vibrant life and ever-present death. It was a world without safety nets, where the most basic necessity, the food on your plate, was a constant and unpredictable threat. Every meal was a lesson in skepticism, and every day, without a debilitating stomach illness, was a victory. Think now of your own kitchen. Think of the refrigerator, that silent humming guardian against decay. Think of the labels on your food with their detailed lists of ingredients, their nutritional information, and their reassuring expiration dates. Think of the clean, running water from your tap and the simple, profound trust you can place in the fact that it won't kill you. These are the quiet luxuries that were built upon the hard-learned lessons of the past. The battles fought by the Victorians in their own stomachs, in public debates, and in the emerging field of public health led directly to the world of safety and abundance we now inhabit. The great food swindles, the tragic outbreaks of disease, and the slow dawning realization that an invisible world of germs was responsible for so much suffering. All of this was the painful process of learning a fundamental truth, that a society is only as healthy as the food it eats. So as we begin to draw the curtains on this journey, don't just remember the horror, remember the resilience, remember the stubborn, defiant joy of a child with a halfpenny sweet, the simple comfort of a hot, if questionable, pie on a cold day, and the communal spirit of sharing a risky meal with a friend. These were people who lived in a dangerous world, and they faced it with a fortitude that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. They were the pioneers of our modern world, and their guts were the unsung frontier they bravely and often unknowingly charted. The treacherous territory of industrial food, and their survival, as well as their suffering, paved the way for the safety we now take for granted. So let us raise an imaginary and thoroughly sterilized glass to them, the iron-stomached survivors of the Victorian age. Having explored the grand deceptions of the Victorian food world, from the pies to the puddings, let us now zoom in on the smallest of details. Let's examine the contents of the spice jar and the salt shaker, the final flourish on any meal. In an era where food was often bland, spoiling, or simply strange, spices were not a luxury. They were a necessity, a heavy hand with the pepper or a dash of mustard was the first line of defense, a powerful tool used to mask the taste of decay and the texture of adulteration. But what if the cover-up was itself a lie? Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger were valuable commodities, often imported from distant corners of the empire. Their high cost made them a prime target for fraud. The honest consumer, seeking to add a little flavor and excitement to a dull meal, was often buying a product that had been stretched, padded, and polluted in ways that were almost impossible to detect with the naked eye. Let's take the most common spice on the table. Black pepper. A pinch of its fiery heat could liven up the most mysterious of stews. But that dark powder in your shaker was often a complex blend of a little actual peppercorn and a lot of cheaper substitutes. Ground mustard husks, pea flour, and linseed meal were common fillers. The most unscrupulous merchants would add what was grimly known as pepper dust, which was quite literally the sweepings from the warehouse. Floors, a gritty mixture of dust, dirt, and whatever else had been tracked. Mustard, with its bright yellow color and pungent kick, was another favorite target. The vibrant color was often not from the mustard seed itself, but from additives like turmeric, or more dangerously, the same toxic lead chromate used to color yellow candies. The powder itself was bulked out with cheap wheat flour, meaning the final product was less of a fiery condiment and more of a brightly colored, vaguely spicy paste. The deception continued throughout the spice rack. Ground ginger might be stretched with sago flour. Curry powder, a fashionable new seasoning, was often colored a rich red with a dose of red lead to make it look more exotic and appealing. Cayenne pepper was sometimes mixed with brick dust, the very ingredients you relied upon to make your questionable food palatable were themselves introducing a new and often invisible layer of contamination and poison. This form of adulteration was particularly insidious. You might be able to spot the greenish tinge on a potato or notice the chalky film in your milk. But how could you possibly tell if your pepper was 30% floor sweepings? You would simply notice that it lacked its characteristic punch, that your food remained stubbornly bland, and that your spice jar seemed to empty much faster than it should. You sit down to your evening meal, a bowl of that working-class stew. You reach for the pepper, hoping to add a bit of life to it. You shake a generous amount over the top, but the expected fiery aroma doesn't rise to greet you. You take a bite. The stew is still bland, and now it has a slightly dusty, gritty texture. The spice, your last hope for flavor, has failed. You have just witnessed the depth of the Victorian food conspiracy. The fraud was so total, so pervasive, that it reached into every corner of the kitchen. The deception was not just in the main ingredients, but in the final finishing touch. In this world, even the cure for the blandness was itself a lie, a final dusty insult in a long day of culinary betrayals. We have talked at length about the solids, the powders, and the pastries that made up the Victorian diet. But now we must turn our attention to the one substance that underpins them all, the liquid that was used to boil the vegetables, brew the tea, and water down the milk. We must talk about the water itself. In Victorian London, a simple glass of water was not a source of refreshment. It was a murky, teeming ecosystem, a cup of what was famously and accurately called monster soup. For most of the city's inhabitants, water was sourced from one of two places, a shallow public well or the River Thames. Both were catastrophically polluted. The Thames was the city's primary drainage ditch, a dumping ground for industrial chemicals, animal carcasses, and the contents of 1 million overflowing cesspits. The shallow wells were no better, as the filth from the ground above would inevitably seep down, contaminating the water table. To look at a glass of this water was to stare into an abyss. It was rarely clear. More often, it was a cloudy yellowish-brown, with visible specks of sediment that would slowly settle to the bottom, if you let it stand. If you were to look under a microscope, as some pioneering scientists of the day did, you would see a horrifying menagerie of writhing, wriggling life. It was a carnival of bacteria, larvae, and microscopic creatures, a complete ecosystem in every drop. But the visible filth, while disgusting, was not the deadliest. The real danger was invisible. The water was a perfect vector for the era's most terrifying disease, cholera. For decades, the prevailing scientific theory held that diseases like cholera were spread by miasma, a foul-smelling vapor, or bad air. It took the tireless work of Dr. John Snow during the horrific outbreak of 1854 to prove the truth. By meticulously mapping the cases, he traced the outbreak to a single contaminated public water pump on Broad Street, proving that the killer was not in the air, but in the water. The private water companies that supplied the city were of little help. Driven by profit, they often built their intakes on the Thames, downstream from where the great sewers emptied their raw contents into the river. They would then pump this liquid, barely filtered, directly into the homes of their paying customers. The result was a citywide system that efficiently delivered not just water, but a constant, reliable supply of disease. In the home, dealing with this water was a daily chore. A family would let their pail of water sit for hours, allowing the worst of the sludge to settle to the bottom before carefully ladling the clearer water off the top. Some instinctively knew that boiling the water made it safer even if they didn't understand the science of germs. Tea was not just a cultural habit. It was a public health measure, a way of making the water less lethal. This monster soup was an ingredient in everything. It was used to wash vegetables, leaving them coated in a thin film of bacteria. It was used to make the street vendors' lemonade, the baker's bread, and the publican's beer. It was the foundational liquid of the entire culinary system, a constant, pervasive source of contamination that touched almost every single thing people ate and drank. So imagine now being faced with a profound and terrible thirst. You stand before a pump, knowing that the water it provides is a cloudy, foul-tasting soup of industrial waste and invisible death. But the alternative is the agony of dehydration. This was the daily, impossible choice for millions. To drink was a gamble, but not to drink was a certainty. In Victorian London, the most essential element for life was also one of the most efficient bringers of death. We have spent much of our time on the streets and in the markets, but now we must follow the food to its final destination before it is eaten. The Victorian home. Let's step into the kitchen of a working-class family. This is not the grand, bustling kitchen of a wealthy estate, but a small, cramped corner of the main living space. Here, in the supposed sanctuary of the home, the food, already compromised by the outside world, faces its final and most intimate set of dangers. The typical kitchen is a dark, damp, and smoky space. A single cast-iron stove, fueled by coal, serves for both cooking and heating, filling the air with a constant haze of soot that settles on every surface. If the family is fortunate, there is a single cold water tap in the room, or a shared one in the hallway. Hot water is a luxury that must be created by boiling a kettle over the fire. Ventilation is poor, and the walls are often slick with condensation. Keeping this space clean is a relentless and often losing battle. Dishes are washed in a basin of cold, contaminated water, with a precious sliver of harsh soap. The same water might be used to wash the dishes, the vegetables, and the family's hands, with little understanding of germ theory. The idea of sanitizing a cutting board or a countertop was entirely foreign. A quick wipe with a damp gray rag was the extent of the daily cleaning ritual. This environment was a paradise for the uninvited guests, who were a constant feature of Victorian domestic life. At night, the kitchen came alive with the skittering sounds of black beetles and cockroaches, emerging from cracks in the floorboards to feast on any stray crumbs. Rats and mice were a constant threat, capable of gnawing through sacks of flour and leaving their contaminated droppings in the larder. In the summer, flies moved freely between the filth of the street and the food on the table. Food storage was a constant challenge in a world without refrigeration. The pantry was often just a small, dark cupboard, which, while cool, was also an ideal breeding ground for mold and bacteria. A piece of meat bought on Saturday would have to be cooked and eaten quickly before it turned milk-soured. In hours bread grew a coat of green fuzz. The housewife waged a constant war against decay, a battle she often lost. This meant that even if a family managed to acquire a piece of good, unadulterated food, it was likely to become contaminated the moment it entered the home. A fresh cut of beef placed on a dirty counter where a beetle had just scurried by was no longer safe. Vegetables washed in the same water sourced from a copper-tainted pump were now a vehicle for disease. Cross-contamination was not an occasional accident. It was an unavoidable fact of life. The Victorian housewife was the general in this domestic war. She fought an endless battle against dirt, dampness, pests, and decay with a very limited arsenal of tools and knowledge. Her efforts to provide a safe and nourishing meal for her family were heroic, but she was often fighting an invisible enemy she did not understand in an environment that was almost perfectly designed to cultivate disease. Imagine the kitchen after the family has gone to sleep. The fire is a dim glow of embers, and the room is quiet. Then the secret life of the house begins. A rat slips out from behind the stove, its nose twitching. Cockroaches emerge from the walls in the larder on the food meant for tomorrow's breakfast. A silent, microscopic battle is being waged between preservation and rot in the Victorian home. The danger was not just outside the door, it was already inside, patiently waiting in the dark. Let us now venture into one of the most vital and visceral hubs of the Victorian neighborhood. The butcher's shop, sawdust stained dark in patches, covers the floor. Great carcasses of beef and mutton hang from iron hooks in the open air, a tempting display of abundance. The air is cool and thick with the metallic, coppery smell of blood. Here, the Victorian consumer came for the centerpiece of their Sunday dinner, a rare and precious joint of meat. But like every other transaction in this era, the purchase was a gamble, a bet against disease, decay, and the butcher's art of deception. The first and most terrifying risk began long before the meat reached the shop. There was virtually no effective government oversight of livestock. Animals that were sick with diseases like tuberculosis, anthrax, or foot-and-mouth disease were often quietly sold and slaughtered. Alongside healthy ones, farmers, desperate to recoup their losses, would sell dying animals for a low price, and an unscrupulous butcher could pass this diseased meat on to an unsuspecting public. The Sunday roast could quite literally be a vector for a deadly illness. The conditions of the slaughterhouses, often located in cramped, filthy cellars behind the shops, were appalling. Sanitation was non-existent. The same wooden block was used for everything, and knives were simply wiped. clean on a bloody apron between tasks with no refrigeration. The meat began its slow journey into decay from the very moment the animal died. It would then hang in the open air of the shop for days, exposed to flies, dust, and the warm, humid air of the city. A skilled butcher, however, was a master of disguise. He had a collection of tricks to make aging meat appear fresh and desirable. A cut that had begun to develop a slimy film would be wiped down with a damp cloth. A piece of beef that was turning a dark, unappealing brown would be rubbed with a piece of fresh red fat to restore its marbled, moist appearance. The most clever butchers used chemicals. A sprinkle of borax or saltpeter could inhibit the smell of decay and restore a healthy reddish glow to meat that was days or even a week old. The poorest customers, of course, could not afford the prime cuts. They were left with the cheapest options. The fatty, tough cuts of brisket, the organ meats that were already beginning to turn, and the anonymous scraps and trimmings that would be sold for a few pennies to be boiled into a thin, greasy stew. These were by definition the oldest and most questionable pieces of meat in the shop, reserved for those who had no choice but to take the greatest risk. The act of buying meat was a tense negotiation. The Victorian housewife would approach the counter with a practiced air of suspicion. She would inspect the joint closely, sniffing it for any hint of off-smell, poking it to test its firmness. She would haggle over the price, her knowledge of the butcher's tricks pitted against his skill at concealing them. Her family's health depended entirely on her ability to distinguish between meat that was merely old and meat that was actively dangerous. You watch as the butcher wraps a joint of mutton in a piece of brown paper. The customer pays her shillings and hurries away, clutching her prize. Now begins the next stage of the meat's perilous journey. It will be taken from the unsanitary shop and into the equally unsanitary kitchen. It will be cooked on a soot-filled stove and eaten by a family with ironclad stomachs and a profound hope that this week's dinner will nourish them rather than sicken them. From the farm to the table, the journey of a piece of meat was a relay race of hazards. Disease, decay, chemicals, and contamination were passed along at every stage. A simple family meal was the final uncertain outcome of a long and bloody gamble. Our long day's journey into the Victorian night is almost at an end. We have walked the foggy streets, navigated the chaotic markets, and peeked into the grimy kitchens of 19th century London. We have tasted the gritty, chalky bread, the sharp metallic Thames of arsenic sweets, and the slick, briny terror of a Thames oyster. We have felt the greasy warmth of a mystery meat pie and the cloying, deceptive sweetness of turnip-based jam. We have survived in imagination a world where every meal was a battle of wits against the vendor and a battle of endurance for the stomach. The central truth of this forgotten world is that the simple daily act of eating was an act of profound bravery. For the vast majority of the population, there was no choice but to trust in the unknown, to consume the suspicious, and to hope for the best. Survival was not an assumption. It was a daily achievement, a small miracle celebrated not with a feast, but with the simple fact of waking up the next morning without a fever. But even in the darkest and most desperate corners of this era, the first glimmers of change were beginning to appear throughout our journey. We have been armed with the knowledge of the future, but the Victorians themselves were slowly and painstakingly uncovering the truth. Scientists and reformers began to challenge the old beliefs. Dr. Arthur Hill, Hazel, using the revolutionary power of the microscope, published a series of shocking reports in The Lancet revealing for the first time the horrifying extent of food adulteration, showing the public the chalk in their bread and the toxins in their sweets. Figures like Dr. John Snow, by proving that the invisible killer of cholera lurked in the water, began to unravel the mysteries of disease that had plagued humanity for centuries. These were the pioneers who fought against a tide of ignorance, corruption, and corporate greed. Their work laid the foundation for the public health movements that would eventually lead to food safety laws, sanitation systems, and the world of effortless trust we now inhabit. It is easy for us to look back with a sense of morbid curiosity, but we must also remember the profound human cost of this era. Behind every story of a tainted sweet or a spoiled pie is a story of real suffering, of a child's chronic stomach pains, of a family weakened by malnutrition, of a life cut short by a preventable disease. Their hardship was the price paid for the knowledge that now protects us. If our journey tonight has given you a new appreciation for your own pantry and for the quiet miracle of a simple, safe meal, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. Your support allows us to continue digging through the dark and often strange corners of history, bringing these forgotten stories into the light. Now, as we prepare to leave this hazardous world behind, let the chaos and the noise of the Victorian street begin to fade. The shouts of the vendors grow distant, the rumble of the carriages softens, and the sharp, anxious smells of the city dissipate into the quiet of the night. You have been a witness to a forgotten struggle, and you can now return to the comfort and the safety of your own time. Take a deep breath and let go of the grit, the grime, and the grease of the past. Let the peace of the present settle over you. The journey is over. The risks have been navigated, and a quiet, well-learned rest is now waiting. And so our tale comes to a close. You have been a silent, ghostly visitor to a world that is at once familiar and terrifyingly strange. You have witnessed the daily, desperate dance of survival, a struggle fought not on a battlefield, but at the market stall, in the kitchen, and around the dinner table. The ghosts of the Victorian age can now recede, taking their hazardous foods and their iron stomachs with them, leaving you in the peaceful quiet of your own time. Take comfort now in the simple, profound luxury of your surroundings. Feel the softness of your pillow and the clean weight of your blanket. Listen to the quiet hum of the modern world, a world free from the clang of the pieman's bell and the morning cry of the milkman with his cart of chalky wares. Your pantry is a place of safety, your water is clean, and your midnight snacks do not require an act of reckless bravery. History is not just a story of kings and empires. It is the collective memory of human experience, written in the grandest of deeds and in the humblest of meals. The taste of a gritty loaf of bread, the fear of a contaminated, the simple, profound joy of a sweet treat. These too are the building blocks of the world we have inherited. So now, let the last echoes of this story gently fade away. Let your mind drift, leaving the foggy, chaotic streets of the past far behind. There are no more risks to navigate, no more mysteries to solve. There is only the calm, steady rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you toward a deep and peaceful rest. Sleep well, and may all of your dreams be sweet, and your snacks reassuringly non-toxic. Good night.